The morning sun barely peeked through the curtains when the chaos outside jolted me awake. I opened my eyes to the sound of engines revving and car doors slamming, definitely not what I expected for a tranquil Saturday. Rushing out of bed, still in my pajamas, I threw on my robe and hurried to the window. To my horror, I saw at least a dozen cars parked in neat rows across my east field, the very space where I had planned to plant corn the following week. My heart raced as I stepped outside, my old dog Rusty barking furiously beside me. There amidst the vehicles stood a woman in a blue blazer with perfectly coiffed hair, waving more cars onto my property as if she owned the place. She had a clipboard in hand and that insincere smile people wear when they think they hold all the power. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I shouted, trying to jog across my yard, anger bubbling within me. The woman turned, her annoyance evident as she flashed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning. I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association." "I don't care if you're the president of the United States," I shot back, struggling to keep my voice steady. "This is private property, my property, and you're trespassing." Margaret tilted her head dismissively, as if addressing a confused child. "Oh, you must be confused. This area was designated as community overflow parking in our HOA bylaws." She glanced at her clipboard and continued condescendingly, "Are you the Davis who lives in the old farmhouse? We've been trying to contact you about joining our association." I pulled out my phone, ready to show her proof of ownership. "Not confused at all. I've never signed any HOA agreement. This land has been in my family for generations. We're not part of your development." Her smile faltered slightly as she replied, "Well, this has been designated community parking for years. The previous board must have had an arrangement with your grandfather." "My grandfather would never allow this," I asserted firmly. "He instilled in me a deep reverence for this land, every inch of it mattered." As our argument escalated, other neighbors began gathering around us. Some appeared embarrassed by the scene unfolding before them, while others wore expressions of annoyance at being held up from their plans. A man clad in golf attire called out impatiently, "Hurry up, we'll be late for the tournament." Just then I noticed something that shifted my focus entirely. A large truck was backing up toward my back field, straight toward the tomato plants I'd nurtured for weeks. Panic surged through me. "Stop that truck right now," I shouted as I broke into a run. "You're destroying my crops." The driver saw me running and hit the brakes just inches from my carefully tended rows of tomatoes. He rolled down his window and said defensively, "Lady at the entrance told me to park big vehicles back here." Margaret was right behind me now, her face flushed with indignation. "Mr. Davis, you're making a scene. We have a community golf tournament today, and this is the designated overflow area." "Says who?" I demanded fiercely. "Show me one document with my signature on it." "Our community bylaws clearly state." "I'm not part of your community," I interrupted sharply. "And you have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff and have them all towed at their owner's expense." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously as she retorted defiantly, "You wouldn't dare." I pulled out my phone and said with conviction, "Try me." Standing in my yard, the reality of the situation hit me like a wave. This wasn't just a piece of land, it was my legacy. My grandfather's farmhouse, with its weathered wood and creaky floors, had been a cornerstone of our family for over 70 years. It was the place where I had learned to plant seeds in the earth, nurture them through hot summers, and watch them grow into vibrant crops. Each inch of this farm held a memory, my first harvest, summer barbecues, and long talks with Grandpa about life and responsibility. I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind as I stared at the parked cars strewn across my east field. "Value every inch of this soil," he used to say. He had instilled in me a deep respect for our land, teaching me that it wasn't just about farming, it was about heritage and identity. This 10-acre plot was not merely land, it represented my family's history, our struggles, and our triumphs. It was where I envisioned my future. The corn I planned to plant next week would have been the beginning of another season filled with hard work and hope. But this morning, it felt as if everything I held dear was under siege. The sight of strangers treating my field like a parking lot made my blood boil. How could they disregard what this land meant to me? The thought that they might have taken advantage of my absence, believing they had some right to use my property as if it were common ground, was infuriating. I glanced at Margaret Wilson, the HOA president who seemed intent on dismissing my family's legacy with a wave of her clipboard. To her, this farm was just another piece of real estate ripe for exploitation. You must be confused, she had said, attempting to brush off my rightful claims with bureaucratic jargon. But there was no confusion, only a fierce determination to protect what belonged to me and my family. As neighbors continued to gather, their expressions ranged from curiosity to discomfort. Some looked on with sympathy, others impatiently awaiting their golf tournament. But all I could think about were the crops now threatened by the encroaching vehicles. My tomato plants, nurtured through careful tending and love, were at risk because of someone else's disregard for boundaries. "Stop that truck," I shouted again as panic surged through me. The driver barely managed to halt before crushing my cherished plants, a testament to how close I had come to losing something precious due to negligence. In that moment, everything crystallized. I wasn't just defending a plot of land. I was standing up for my family's history and future dreams. This fight wasn't merely about parking spaces. It represented a broader struggle against those who believed they could claim authority over my life without understanding or respecting its significance. "Value every inch," I reminded myself as I faced Margaret again, her condescension palpable. I wouldn't let her or the HOA diminish what this farm stood for or how hard my family had fought to maintain it. With resolve solidifying within me, I knew that protecting this land would require more than words. It would demand action, a commitment to safeguarding not only my rights but also the legacy that had been passed down through generations. The stakes were high, but so was my determination. This wasn't just about property lines, it was about fighting for what truly mattered, a fight worth undertaking for the sake of history and future generations yet to come. As I squared off with Margaret Wilson, the HOA president, a tension hung in the air thick enough to slice. She stood there, clipboard in hand, wearing that same insincere smile that had initially fueled my anger. The sun was rising higher, and the warmth felt almost mocking as I faced her down. My blood boiled with indignation as I thought about her casual disregard for my family's legacy. "Why do you think you can just come onto my property and take over?" I demanded, my voice steady but laced with fury. "This isn't some community lot, this is my land." Margaret tilted her head slightly, a gesture that made me feel like a child being scolded. "Oh, you must be confused," she said, her tone patronizing. "This area has been designated as community overflow parking in our HOA bylaws." She glanced at her clipboard again as if it held all the answers to my legitimate concerns. "Are you the Davis who lives in the old farmhouse?" "We've been trying to contact you about joining our association," she continued, as if that would somehow justify her actions. "Not confused at all," I shot back, pulling out my phone to show her my property deed. "I've never signed any HOA agreement. This land has been in my family for generations. We're not part of your development." Her smile wavered and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "Well, this has been designated community parking for years. The previous board must have had an arrangement with your grandfather." "My grandfather would never allow this," I replied firmly, recalling countless lessons he taught me about respecting our land and standing up for what was right. He had always insisted on valuing every inch of this soil, a principle I held dear. As we argued, more neighbors began to gather around us, their expressions revealing a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some looked embarrassed by what they were witnessing, others seemed annoyed at the delay. A man dressed in golf attire called out impatiently from the sidelines, "Hurry up, we'll be late for the tournament." His words stung like a bee. Here I was fighting for my rights while they were focused solely on their leisure plans. Then something caught my attention that made me forget the parking dispute entirely. A large truck was backing up toward my back field, straight toward the tomato plants I had nurtured for weeks. My heart sank as adrenaline coursed through me. "Stop that truck right now," I shouted, breaking into a run as panic surged through me. "You're destroying my crops." The driver slammed on his brakes just inches from my precious rows of tomatoes and rolled down his window. "Lady at the entrance told me to park big vehicles back here," he said defensively. Frustrated beyond measure, I whirled around to find Margaret right behind me, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Davis, you're making a scene," she admonished sharply. "We have a community golf tournament today, and this is the designated overflow area." "Says who?" I retorted fiercely. "Show me one document with my signature on it." "Our community bylaws clearly state." "I'm not part of your community," I interrupted vehemently. "And you have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff and have them all towed at their owner's expense." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously, disbelief etched across her features. "You wouldn't dare," she challenged. With determination solidifying within me, I pulled out my phone and shot back defiantly, "Try me." The battle lines had been drawn, there was no turning back now. This was more than just an argument, it was a fight for my family's legacy and my right to protect what belonged to me. Margaret's expression shifted as I stood there, phone in hand, ready to defend my rights. The tension between us crackled like static electricity in the air. She was trying to assert her authority, but I was not about to back down. "Oh, you must be confused," she repeated, her tone dripping with condescension. "This area was designated as community overflow parking in our HOA bylaws." She glanced down at her clipboard as if the printed words held all the power in this dispute. "Designated? By whom?" I asked, my voice rising with each word. "I've never signed any HOA agreement. You're claiming rights to my land based on some bylaws that don't pertain to me." Margaret's perfect smile began to falter. "Are you the Davis who lives in the old farmhouse? We've been trying to contact you about joining our association," she replied, her voice growing defensive. "Not confused at all," I shot back, pulling out my property deed to emphasize my point. "This land has been in my family for generations, long before your fancy houses were built around it. We are not part of your development or your community." Her demeanor shifted again, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Well, this has been designated community parking for years. The previous board must have had an arrangement with your grandfather." "An arrangement?" I repeated incredulously. "You think my grandfather would have allowed this? He taught me to value every inch of this soil, not to mention he believed in standing up for what was right. This isn't just a piece of property, it's our heritage." Around us, neighbors continued to gather, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some people looked embarrassed by the unfolding scene, while others seemed more focused on their golf tournament plans than on the injustice occurring right before their eyes. A man dressed in his golf attire called out impatiently from the sidelines, "Hurry up, we'll be late for the tournament." In that moment, I felt a surge of determination coursing through me. This fight was about more than just cars parked on my land. It was about respect for my family's history and for the boundaries we had established over decades. "Show me one document with my signature on it that states I agreed to any of this," I demanded, locking eyes with Margaret as I held my ground. "Our community bylaws clearly state," she began again, but I interrupted her. "I'm not part of your community," I asserted fiercely. "And you have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff and have them all towed at their owner's expense." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously as she processed my ultimatum. "You wouldn't dare," she challenged me, her confidence wavering. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone, ready to make that call if needed. "Try me," I said firmly. The weight of our confrontation hung heavily in the air as I stood resolute against her dismissive attitude. This wasn't just about parking, it was about standing up for myself and for the legacy of my family's farm. As neighbors looked on, some whispering among themselves, I knew that this moment would define not only how they viewed me, but also how we all interacted moving forward. The fight for my land had begun, and there was no going back now. Margaret might have thought she could steamroll over me and my history, but I was determined to protect what was rightfully mine, no matter the cost. As the argument escalated, I could feel the tension in the air thickening, wrapping around us like a storm cloud ready to burst. My focus was torn between the confrontation with Margaret and the alarming sight of that large truck backing toward my back field. The space between us felt charged with anger and defiance, but suddenly it shifted to something much more immediate and urgent. "Stop that truck right now," I shouted, breaking into a sprint as panic surged through me. My heart raced as I realized the driver was completely unaware of how close he was to destroying my crops. "You're destroying my tomatoes." The truck abruptly hit the brakes just inches from my carefully tended rows. I could feel my stomach drop as I watched its massive frame looming over my plants, their vibrant green leaves swaying nervously in the breeze. The driver rolled down his window, looking confused and slightly annoyed. "Lady at the entrance told me to park big vehicles back here," he said, as if this somehow absolved him of responsibility. I turned on my heels, ready to confront Margaret once more. She stood behind me, her face flushed with frustration and anger at being challenged in front of her neighbors. "Mr. Davis, you're making a scene," she admonished, her tone sharp and impatient. "We have a community golf tournament today, and this is the designated overflow area." "Designated by whom?" I shot back, feeling the heat of indignation rise within me. "Show me one document that proves I agreed to any of this." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she prepared her response, but I could see that she was losing her grip on the situation. "Our community bylaws clearly state." I don't care about your bylaws, I interrupted vehemently, gesturing toward my field that was now under threat. I'm not part of your community, I don't owe you anything, and you have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff and have them all towed at their owner's expense. Margaret scoffed, disbelief etched across her features. You wouldn't dare, she challenged, her confidence faltering as she processed my words. Try me, I replied firmly, holding up my phone as if it were a shield against her arrogance. The reality of what was happening began to sink in for everyone gathered around us. The initial focus on parking disputes had shifted dramatically. No longer was it just about cars blocking a field. It was about protecting my hard work and investments in this land that meant everything to me. As I stood there, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I glanced over at my tomato plants again. Each one represented hours of labor and love, the anticipation of harvesting ripe fruit that would feed not just me, but also friends and neighbors who appreciated good food. The thought of losing them felt like a dagger to my heart. I surveyed the crowd of neighbors who had been watching our confrontation unfold. Some looked uneasy, others were whispering among themselves, likely unsure about how to react to this escalating conflict between their HOA president and a local farmer fighting for his rights. Do you all really think this is okay? I called out to them, voice steady but filled with emotion. Do you believe it's right for someone to come onto private property without permission? This isn't just about parking, it's about respect for land that has been cared for by generations. The silence hung heavy in the air as they absorbed what I was saying. It wasn't just me fighting, it was a call for all of us to acknowledge boundaries and honor the work we put into our homes, whether they were farms or houses. In that moment, the stakes felt higher than ever. This confrontation had transformed into something larger, a battle for dignity and honor that extended beyond just my tomato plants or Margaret's clipboard. It was about standing up against an unjust intrusion into our lives and livelihoods. As the confrontation reached its peak, more and more neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion and the escalating tension between Margaret and me. The scene felt surreal. People stood in clusters, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Some were clearly annoyed at being delayed, their impatience evident as they glanced at their watches or exchanged frustrated whispers. Others appeared genuinely uneasy, caught off guard by the unfolding drama. Come on, let's wrap this up, called out a man dressed in golf attire, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. We're going to be late for our tournament. His impatience was palpable, as if the activities on my farm were merely an inconvenience interrupting his day. But as I looked around, I could see that not everyone shared his perspective. Many neighbors watched with their arms crossed, eyebrows furrowed in discomfort. A few exchanged glances, as if silently acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. It was clear that some were embarrassed by Margaret's actions and her insistence on using my property without permission. Is this really how we treat our neighbors? I called out, trying to address the gathering crowd. Do you think it's okay for someone to come in and take over another person's land? This is about respect, respect for my family's history and for boundaries. Margaret shifted uncomfortably at my words, clearly not prepared for this kind of public scrutiny. Some neighbors seemed to lean closer, visibly contemplating my point while others maintained their distance, unsure of where to stand. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her expression softening as she spoke up. I remember your grandfather, she said gently. He worked so hard on this land, he wouldn't have wanted this. Her words struck a chord with many in attendance. I could see nods of agreement ripple through the crowd. It was a reminder that this land held deep connections for people beyond just me. It represented shared memories, community history, and hard work. Margaret's confidence began to wane as I continued to assert myself. This isn't just a parking lot for your tournament, I declared firmly. This is my home, my livelihood, and I'm not going to let anyone trample on it. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer just a dispute between me and Margaret, it had become a community issue. Some neighbors began murmuring support for me while others voiced their discontent with how the HOA had treated local property owners like myself. This isn't right, one man finally spoke up, breaking through the murmurs. We should respect Mr. Davis's property. His voice held a weight that resonated with many standing around us. Margaret's face flushed deeper as she realized she was losing ground, not just in this argument but also in her standing among her neighbors. We can settle this amicably, she said, attempting to regain some semblance of control over the conversation. Amicably? I scoffed, incredulous at her suggestion after everything that had transpired. You've already crossed that line by assuming authority over my land without consent. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone watched our confrontation unfold. This wasn't just about parking spaces anymore. It had transformed into a revelation of community values and boundaries being tested against the backdrop of Margaret's seemingly unchecked authority. As I stood there facing Margaret and the crowd that had gathered around us, I felt a surge of determination flow through me. It was no longer just my fight. It was about standing up for what was right, not only for myself, but also for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or overlooked in their own community. The divide among my neighbors was clear. Some siding with Margaret and her HOA authority, while others recognized the importance of protecting individual rights and respecting personal property. Whatever happened next would shape not only my immediate future, but also redefine our relationships within this community moving forward. The atmosphere around us thickened as I stood firm, my phone in hand, ready to take action if necessary. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, not just as a property owner, but as someone who had inherited a legacy from my grandfather. The tension was palpable, and I knew that I had to make my position clear, not just for myself, but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. "You have exactly 1 hour to remove these vehicles from my property," I stated, my voice steady and resolute. "If they're not gone by then, I will call the sheriff and have them towed at the owner's expense." Margaret's eyes narrowed, disbelief crossing her face. "You wouldn't dare," she challenged, trying to regain some semblance of authority, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty behind her bravado. She hadn't expected me to fight back so fiercely. "Try me," I replied firmly, holding my ground. My heart raced, not from fear but from adrenaline and determination. This was no longer just an argument. It was a stand against someone who thought they could dictate how I managed my own land. The neighbors watching us seemed taken aback by my ultimatum. Some exchanged glances, clearly surprised that I was willing to escalate things to this level. Others nodded slightly, perhaps feeling a sense of solidarity with my plight. It was evident that Margaret's grip on the situation was slipping as the crowd reacted to my boldness. "Listen," I continued, addressing the gathering crowd while keeping my gaze fixed on Margaret. "This isn't just about parking spaces or a golf tournament. This is about respect for property rights and community values. You can't just assume control over someone else's land because it's convenient for your plans." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. My grandfather would never have allowed this kind of treatment of our family's land. He taught me the importance of standing up for what's right, not only for myself but also for our community. As my words hung in the air, I noticed a few more neighbors shifting their attitudes. Some began murmuring in agreement while others looked conflicted between their support for the HOA and their respect for my situation. One neighbor finally stepped forward, raising a hand as if to speak on my behalf. "Mr. Davis is right," he said, his voice steady yet respectful. "We should all be honoring personal boundaries here. No one should feel pressured into giving up their land for someone else's convenience." What? Hearing those words felt like a small victory amidst the chaos. It was a reminder that there were still people who valued integrity and community spirit over convenience and entitlement. "Margaret," I said, turning back to her with renewed conviction, "you have 1 hour to get your vehicles off my property before I take action. This isn't just an empty threat, it's my right as a landowner." Her expression faltered as she realized she might not have the support she thought she had among her neighbors. The weight of the situation now rested heavily on her shoulders. She could either choose to respect my wishes or risk further humiliation in front of the very community she claimed to represent. As I glanced around at those gathered, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncertain, I realized that this moment could reshape our relationships within this community moving forward. It was more than just a dispute over parking. It was about asserting our rights and standing together against those who would try to undermine us. With steely resolve, I stood at the center of it all, prepared to defend not only my land, but also the values we should all uphold as neighbors: respect, dignity, and mutual understanding. The stage was set for whatever would come next, but one thing was clear: I wouldn't be backing down without a fight. Margaret's expression hardened as she processed my ultimatum. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could see a flicker of doubt cross her face, a sign that perhaps she hadn't expected me to stand my ground so firmly. "You think you can just threaten me in the homeowners association? You're making a huge mistake," she challenged, her voice rising slightly. "I'm not the one making the mistake here, Margaret," I replied, unwavering. "You are. Trespassing on private property isn't just unacceptable, it's illegal. And I won't let you or anyone else trample over my rights just because it suits your plans for the day." With that, I pulled out my phone and began to document the situation. I aimed the camera at the parked cars in my fields and then at Margaret, capturing her frustrated demeanor. "I'm documenting this," I stated clearly. "Not just for myself, but for anyone who might need to see how you and the HOA operate. This isn't just about parking, it's about standing up against an authority that thinks it can override personal property rights." Margaret's frustration was palpable as she crossed her arms, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. "This isn't going to end well for you, Mr. Davis," she warned, trying to regain some authority in her voice. "You're just one person against an entire community." I shook my head, feeling a mix of determination and defiance surge within me. "You may have a community behind you, but that doesn't mean you have the right to bully others into submission. My family has worked this land for generations, long before your fancy bylaws were even thought of." The crowd of neighbors continued to watch us closely, their reactions revealing a spectrum of opinions. Some seemed uneasy, clearly siding with Margaret and her HOA authority, while others appeared more sympathetic to my cause, perhaps recognizing the injustice in what was happening. "You might want to think about how this affects your reputation in this community," I added, addressing both Margaret and those gathered around us. Standing behind someone who disrespects land ownership is not a good look for anyone involved. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but paused as she scanned the crowd. A few neighbors nodded in agreement with my words, softening her bravado just slightly. I could see that she was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a simple confrontation, it was becoming a defining moment for our community's values. "I'm serious," I pressed on, my voice steady. "You have 1 hour to remove these vehicles from my property before I contact law enforcement." Her eyes narrowed again as she tried to maintain her composure. "You really think you can get away with this?" she asked incredulously. "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "I'm prepared to fight for my rights and protect what belongs to me, my land and my family's legacy." As the seconds ticked away, I felt the weight of history resting on my shoulders. Both my grandfather's teachings and the promise I made to myself when I inherited this farm, to always stand up for what is right. The crowd began murmuring among themselves again, some expressing concern about how things had escalated, while others voiced support for me taking a stand against Margaret and her HOA tactics. This was no longer just about parking or golf tournaments. It had transformed into a pivotal moment where community values were being tested against authority and entitlement. With my phone still recording and resolve burning bright within me, I stood ready, not just to defend my land, but also to protect the principles that should unite us all as neighbors. In that charged atmosphere filled with uncertainty, one thing became crystal clear. I wouldn't back down without a fight, and the outcome of this confrontation could change everything for everyone involved. As the confrontation escalated, an unsettling tension settled over the gathering crowd. I could sense that this was no longer just a dispute over parking spaces. It was evolving into something much larger. The stakes were rising, and I could feel that this moment would ripple through our community in ways that none of us could fully predict. "Mr. Davis," Margaret said, her tone now laced with a mix of annoyance and desperation, "you're making a decision that will affect not just you but all of us. The HOA has rules for a reason, and you can't just disregard them because it's inconvenient for you." I met her gaze with unwavering determination. "The only thing I'm disregarding is your assumption that you can dictate what happens on my land without my consent. You may have rules, but they don't apply to me. This land has been in my family for generations, long before your bylaws were even written." The murmurs among the neighbors grew louder, adding to the palpable tension. Some appeared supportive of my stance, while others seemed torn between their loyalty to the HOA and their respect for my rights as a landowner. It was evident that Margaret's authority was being challenged in front of an audience, and that shift was not lost on either of us. "Are you really prepared to take this to court?" Margaret challenged, her voice rising slightly as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You think this is just going to end here? The HOA has resources you can't even begin to contend with." I felt a surge of resolve at her words. She was inadvertently foreshadowing a much larger conflict ahead. "If it comes to that, then so be it," I replied firmly. "I will fight for my rights and my family's legacy, no matter what it takes." The realization hung heavy in the air. This wasn't merely about parking anymore. It was about standing up against an organization that believed it could impose its will on individuals without consequence. I could see some neighbors shifting uncomfortably, wrestling with their own thoughts about the HOA's authority versus individual property rights. Standing there, sensing the shifting tides among my neighbors, I realized that timing truly changes everything. Just like subscribing to this channel apparently helps you win HOA battles, at least that's the rumor in our comments. But back to the story, strengthening my resolve, I prepared for whatever came next, determined to protect my family's legacy against Margaret and anyone else who thought they could overstep their boundaries. The truth is, I continued, this might just be the beginning of a much bigger battle, not just for me, but for anyone who feels their rights are being trampled by the very people who should be supporting them. Margaret's expression shifted from irritation to something resembling concern as she processed the implications of my words. "You're threatening our community," she said defensively. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "I'm protecting what's mine. If that leads to division in our community, then perhaps it's time we all take a closer look at how we treat each other and what we value." The crowd seemed to react. Some nodded in agreement while others whispered among themselves, unsure of how they felt about this brewing conflict. The very essence of our community was at stake: trust versus entitlement, neighborly respect versus bureaucratic overreach. As I stood there with my phone still recording, I knew this moment would echo long after today's events unfolded. Whatever happened next would set a precedent, not just for me but for everyone who called this place home. The path ahead was uncertain. Legal disputes loomed large on the horizon, along with potential divisions between neighbors who had once shared barbecues and friendly chats over the fence. My heart pounded not out of fear but from the weight of responsibility. I was about to embark on a journey that might change everything. With Margaret glaring at me defiantly and neighbors watching closely, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for whatever came next. This confrontation was only the beginning, a catalyst for change that promised to reshape our relationships and redefine what it meant to be part of this community. The battle lines had been drawn. Now it was time to see how far we were willing to go to protect our rights and values. As I stood there, phone poised to document the unfolding situation, it became clear that this confrontation was about more than just me and Margaret. It was a moment that resonated with many in our community, those who had experienced similar frustrations, misunderstandings, or even outright conflicts with their neighbors or homeowners associations. I invite you all to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever faced a situation where your rights felt disrespected? Maybe you've dealt with neighbors who overstepped their boundaries, or perhaps you've been caught in the crossfire of HOA regulations that seemed unreasonable or unfair. It can be frustrating to feel like your home isn't truly yours because of rules and bylaws that don't take into account the personal stories tied to those properties. I want to hear from you. What happened in your case? Did you stand your ground, or did you find another way to resolve the issue? How did it affect your relationships with those around you? Community dynamics can be complicated, and sharing our stories can help us understand each other better and strengthen our sense of belonging. Feel free to comment below about where you're watching from and any similar experiences you've had. Your stories matter, and they contribute to a larger conversation about property rights, community values, and the importance of standing up for oneself. As I faced Margaret and the growing crowd of neighbors, I felt a sense of unity building among us despite the tension in the air. This wasn't just about parking spaces. It was about asserting our rights as individuals and respecting one another's homes. Each story shared could help illuminate different perspectives, allowing us to grow as a community. Perhaps my confrontation with Margaret would inspire others to speak up when they felt wronged or overlooked. Maybe it would encourage conversations about how we treat each other as neighbors and the importance of cultivating respect and understanding within our community. So let's engage in this dialogue together. What do you think? How should we navigate these complexities in our neighborhoods? What lessons can we learn from one another? This isn't just my fight, it's a collective struggle against complacency and entitlement. Let's share our experiences, support each other, and work toward solutions that honor both individual rights and community spirit. Your voice is important in this narrative. Let's make it heard. As I prepared for whatever would come next in this standoff with Margaret, I felt empowered by the knowledge that I was not alone in this fight. Together, we could redefine what it meant to be part of a community, one that values fairness, respects boundaries, and honors the histories tied to every piece of land. So please chime in below. Let's spark a conversation that matters.